Welcome back to Monday Moments. We're doing a different format today, and you'll have to let me know if you like it or not. I wanted you to be able to see the screens better. And so, as we go into interpreting the New Testament epistles, I thought we'd try it this way. Well, epistle is just another word for letter. And in comparison to their ancient counterparts, the New Testament letters are typically a little longer than, say, the letter that Cicero would write or Seneca would write. This added length allowed the writer, Paul, Peter, James, John, to shepherd churches from a distance. When we look at the letters, we see that 21 out of 27 of the New Testament books are actually epistles. You see that we have Paul writing 13 of those. We don't know who the author of Hebrews is. James, Peter, John wrote 3, and Jude. So Jesus' two brothers, James and Jude, each wrote 1. And their books, along with Peter and John, are named after themselves. That's why we have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Whereas Paul's letters are named after who the recipients, the individual or the groups of people that they were being written to. So there you have it. And those letters, while they are 21 out of 27, I don't know the math on that, but that's over 50%. That's probably like 75% or something. But the letters actually take up only 35% of the volume of the New Testament, because the Gospels are so large, and then Revelation is also a very large book. So, what are the characteristics of New Testament letters? The letters were written as authoritative substitutes for the personal presence of the author. For example, 2 Peter and Ephesians and Galatians, those are really good examples of the writer sending an authoritative substitute and exhorting or correcting the audience, the recipients. Furthermore, the New Testament letters were occasional or situational. This means they were written to address a specific situation and or problem in many cases that the original audience was facing. And so they would consult their shepherd, the one that planted the church, perhaps, like Paul did, and they would ask them questions, and they would respond to those questions because they weren't physically present with them. So, like in Thessalonians, Paul is clarifying an issue, whereas he's addressing a doctrinal problem in Colossians. Since the letters are situational, they should not be read as if they are a systematic theology. This is thus the study of God, and this is the way that it goes. No, we read the letter and we keep in mind that it's occasional and it's situational. So we must not be we must be cautious not to give too much consideration to any given letter. We need to read the letter and compare it in light of the rest of the New Testament and the whole Bible. We consider the whole Bible, right? Not just the one letter. Here's a good example of that. The situation in 1 Timothy 2. 1 Timothy 2, verses 11, 12. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. This is a perfect situation to show that it seems that Paul is contradicting himself from the commendations he makes in Romans 12 or his advocacy of Phoebe as an apostle. So, why would he say that about women and then say this about women? He's not contradicting himself. You have to understand the historical cultural context of Ephesus at the time where Timothy was shepherding, and Paul is saying, I do not permit a woman. So it's a singular, it's a specific woman who was spreading a heresy and that because women often in the New Testament time and biblical times were often sought after, and they because they were easily deceived because they weren't allowed to get educated. And so heretics and other cult like leaders would go after them, teach them these things, and then that's how these things would spread. And this woman was most likely teaching a distorted view of creation where Eve came before Adam, which was which was common, especially in Ephesus and in Crete, where Titus was preaching at that time. This often happened, this dualistic philosophy, if you will. And Paul was aware of this, and he was trying to correct her lovingly, and he doesn't call her by name, but he is talking about a woman. And when you understand the grammar of that, you understand the historical cultural context of that, you see why letters are situational. We're not going to make a theology or a doctrine out of this because it is not conducive with the rest of the scriptures and what Jesus did, especially being such a revolutionary when it came to women in ministry. Characteristics of the New Testament, again, they were written and delivered. They were written by scribes that were very, very highly trained, but the author had the final authority of the letter, the final contents of the letter. And here's how the process went. Often there were co-senders. Paul has co-senders in quite a few of his letters. So the co-sender, let's say it was Timothy. The co-sender would discuss it with Paul, then they would draft up a letter, they would edit the letter, then many times they would rewrite the letter. It was a lengthy process. It's not like when we write a letter, it's not our century thinking about writing a letter, sending a card in the mail. And then they would rewrite it, and then a final copy would be written. And Paul would then instruct whoever he was going to send the letter with about the contents of the letter, so that in person, when he sends Epaphroditus, for example, that person could explain more the heart behind the letter that Paul was sending, or Peter or James. There was a postal system during the New Testament times, but it was only for government documents and government officials. So they had to find somebody reliable and who shared the same passion for the ministry that they did as they were sending a letter to their recipients. Another characteristic of a New Testament letter was that they were intended to be read in community. They were intended to be read aloud and over again. Not only this, many of them were requested inside the letter to be shared with another church. For example, in Colossians 4:16, Paul says for the Colossians to share their letter with the believers in Laodicea. And this was common. They didn't lend them to individuals. That would be dangerous because you may never get the letter back. They often also read them in community because they were used to this as former Jews. That's what they were used to, reading the Torah aloud in synagogue. And again, many of them would have been uneducated, especially the women. So reading them aloud in community was the expectation. What's the form of New Testament letters? Much like our letters, especially like you learned in school, you have a greeting, sometimes a salute, and then the body, the conclusion, the salutation, right? Not really an address box and a recipient box, but often during the greeting, you would have the author's name, the recipient's name or names, the greeting, and an introductory prayer. Now, the body of the letter would have, this isn't a full list, but a lot of times it would have instruction and or persuasion, a rebuke. We saw that in Galatians last week, didn't we? Exhortation. And then the conclusion always had a benediction of grace, but it also could include travel plans. what is it? I can't remember what letter that's in. And then commendations, like in Romans 16, when Paul um, commends all of the other uh, deacons, and there's a lot of women. I think it's 11 out of the 16 mentioned in there are that those numbers might not be right. It's been a while since my dissertation, that are women. And then doxology, like in Jude. Jude verses 24 and 25 have a doxology as a part of the conclusion. Interpreting New Testament letters, what we need to remember. We need to remember that, first of all, this is sometimes difficult because some of them are longer. If you want to read Philemon or you want to read even James, I think there's 5 or 6 chapters, but some of them are longer, like Romans has 16 chapters, and it's heavy theology. It's great theology, but in the perfect sense, you want to read the letter from the beginning to the end in one sitting to fully be able to comprehend and interpret what the author's intention is. That's where you get the purpose of the letter, the flow of it. And we try to reconstruct the historical cultural context. We've gone over that a lot. We just saw that in 1 Timothy. Observe the literary context. Study significant words. Compose a theological principle. Compare that theological principle to the rest of the Bible, and then apply the theology to your life. So let's see how we're going to do this. We are going to look at Hebrews 12 verses 1 and 2. But before we do that and read it together, I wanted to give you some of the historical cultural context of that. First, it was written to Jewish converts who lived near Rome. That should say lived. So that's very important to know. It's not written to Gentiles. It's written to Gentile converts who are living not in Jerusalem, they're living in Rome. And it's prior to a period of intense persecution by Nero. So this is written about the mid-60s. The recipients are tempted to reject Christianity. They're ready to be done with it because of how hard it is and how to be isolated, and that they are enduring some persecution. And they're tempted to reject that Christianity and return to Judaism. And the purpose of the letter is to encourage the believers to persevere. That is what the author of Hebrews, he or she, many of you know that follow me know that it's my personal hope and maybe my professional agenda to figure out if it actually is Priscilla. So let's read Hebrews 11. I think that's what we're going to do next. And as we do that, look for some of the literary context that we talked about. Look for figures of speech. Look for specific words. Look for transition words, right? Our connecting words. What else could you look for? Just try to find out what the tone is. If you can tell the tone for Hebrews 12, the tone of the letter. And let's go ahead and do that. So, first thing we see is therefore. That's connecting us back to Hebrews 11. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. What do you think the tone is? What would you describe the tone of Hebrews 12? I would say it sounds serious. This is a serious exhortation by the author of Hebrews. You know, he or she is encouraging them, and he's also saying, Jesus is the pioneer and perfecter. That's in a positive for him, right? He's describing him, and he's marked out the race for you. You can do it. It's serious in tone, but it's also encouraging, right? It's persuasive. And I think it reads much like a sermon. So let's look at this literary context. Therefore, indicates that the passage is closely tied to the previous chapter. If you know anything about Hebrews 11 is called the history of the Hall of Fame of Faith, or it's when the writer goes through all the people of the Bible who are not faithful people, some of them who had very tainted testimonies, if you will, but saying, look, these people have gone before you. We have examples of people that have overcome. And so it's connecting to them. If your ancestors could do it, if your grandfathers can do it, you can do it too. In the following verses, so chapter 13, so we're in chapter 12, chapter 13, because you would have read this already in the whole sitting. And the following verses in chapter 13 is an analogy of parental love for a child. So this is significant. You have the Hall of Faith or Fame before this. And then after chapter 12, you have an analogy of parental love for a child. And in the middle sits Hebrews 12, with the author saying, these are the people that came from before you. I am encouraging you. You can run this race. And I'm saying this to you because I love you as a parent loves a child and would do anything for that child. Now, some significant words that I think are in Hebrews 12 or figures of speech are great cloud of witnesses, right? Throw off. Okay, throw off. I'm going to throw off everything. When I think of throwing off stuff, I don't, it's like, and throwing off everything that hinders you. And when you read commentaries, specifically, Craig Keener's commentary talks about in ancient Greece, we know that the Olympics started there, right? And so in ancient Greece, there was always races, always running. And what would happen is, as they're running, you know what kind of clothes that they wore and togas and different things. And as they're running the race, what would happen is by the end of the race, many of the racers would not have any clothing on because they would throw off anything that would hinder them from winning the race. And that is what Paul is saying. I keep saying Paul because it's usually Paul, right? 13 letters. That's what the author of Hebrews is saying. Let's go back to that. And it's saying, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. So the author is saying, you know what? If that sheet, I'm going to call it a sheet, if that's entangling you, just like sin does, run. Take it off, throw it off, so that you can do everything in your might and power to win the race, to run the race to victory, to faithfulness for Jesus. And it talks about running with perseverance and fixing our eyes on Jesus, who was the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Okay, so we looked at their place with literary context, with historical cultural context. So we looked at that. Now we're going to summarize that. This is their place before we go to our place, right? On our journey. The author of Hebrews uses the image of a long distance race to challenge his or her audience to persevere in their commitment to Christ in spite of opposition. This would be my summary or my synthesis statement. Now we're going to go to the forest of differences. What are some differences between those Jewish converts in Rome and us today? Well, for me, I know, especially living in America, I do not face the same level of persecution as the original audience did. And for me, I'm not tempted to revert back to Judaism. Those are some differences between the original audience and myself. There's not another religion if I left Christianity that I'm tempted to go back to. Now, okay, so this would be different, right? For someone that's a Muslim and decides to convert to Christianity, there would be temptation probably to revert back, especially if that person, which in most cases happens, they lose all of their family. They're shunned from their community, if not persecuted and killed. Are place similarities. So, what is similar between me and the original audience? We as Christians are runners. The race equals life. Life is a race. And life is difficult. We may not have the same kind of difficulties, but life is difficult. We're still easily tempted by sin. And Jesus is still the perfect example of endurance. He was for them, and he is for us here today. So now I would think what would connect the original audience and myself. So from the text, I see that the saints who have gone before us supply examples of endurance. We should look to them for inspiration and encouragement. Jesus is our perfect example of endurance. He is the champion and the forerunner as he already marked out the race for us. He's gone before us. Here's another theological principle. Remember, many times there could be more than one. To run the race successfully, we need to reject things in life that hinder our progress, and most importantly, focus on Jesus and our relationship with him. We focus on Jesus and our relationship with him. So then I would compare these theological principles with the rest of the Bible. Does it contradict the rest of the Bible? Does the rest of the Bible confirm this? And I would say it does. And then I would come to the last step, and that would be to apply it to my life. The Christian life is like a difficult long distance race, which requires both effort on our part and endurance on our part. And what we can give, and Jesus takes the rest. We do what he requires of us, and sometimes we have to endure persecution. We have to endure suffering because that's what makes us more like him. Our spiritual formation is a marathon, not a sprint. We must do our part and let God do his. Even when we are tired, we must endure like Christ endured the cross, because he did it on your behalf and he did it on my behalf. Amen.